We have a saying in the United States, in the English language, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste.
Sejam bem-vindos a mais uma entrevista do UM BRASIL, em parceria com o Instituto Atuação. Segundo o que Samuel Huntington chamou de a terceira onda de democratização, quando o mundo presenciou um aumento significativo no número de democracias, indo de aproximadamente 1/4 em 1974 dos países para mais de metade dos países atualmente, estamos hoje passando por um momento de esforços atrapalhados, digamos, e com resultados não tão positivos, de melhorar a qualidade da democracia em países já democráticos e de expandir o alcance de práticas e valores democráticos no restante do mundo. Hoje vamos discutir essa questão que é muito contemporânea, cheia de incertezas e possivelmente uma das mais fundamentais para a civilização moderna. Estamos passando por uma recessão democrática e o que podemos fazer nesse cenário? Meu nome é Jamil Assis, eu sou Relações Públicas do Instituto Atuação e para nos apoiar com esse ponto de vista único, mas também bastante universal para o assunto, eu tenho o prazer de receber aqui um dos mais influentes e renomados pensadores em democracia e desenvolvimento. Ele que é professor e pesquisador na Universidade de Stanford, onde também codirige o Centro para Democracia, Desenvolvimento e Estado de Direito. Também foi cofundador e coeditor da importante publicação Journal of Democracy, editando mais de 30 livros sobre democracia. Ele está aqui no Brasil, inclusive, para o lançamento da segunda Coletânea da Democracia do Instituto Atuação, que conta com uma obra sua inédita para entender a democracia. Professor Larry Diamond, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a frequent topic of your writings, about the advances and recessions of democracy in the world. But as important as this status is knowing if people actually want democracy. In your book, The Spirit of Democracy, you argue in favor of democracy's universal value. However, recent polls by World Values Survey show that the percentage of people in the USA, in Western Europe, the advanced industrial countries, that consider it essential to live under a democratically elected government has dramatically decreased from one generation to the next. In the US, only about 1/3 of millennials considered it essential to live in a democracy. In Brazil, as well as in many parts of the world, in the democratic world, we see a deep dissatisfaction with politics. So, in light of all this data, how do you see the future of democracy for the world?
Well, first I think we need to understand the data with more care and precision than is sometimes presented. The public opinion survey you cited asked people to rate how important democracy is, how important it is to live in a democracy on a scale of, I think, 0 to 10. The decline you saw was in the percentage of people saying 10. So there's been a sharp decline in that. I'm not sure it's saying that young people no longer want to live in a democracy. It's saying they have more doubts than they used to have. And this reflects the reality of democracy not performing well, of being a venue of polarization and of disappointing and dysfunction and disappointing performance. I think it reflects a real trend of increasing doubt about democracy in some circles. It reflects some tentativeness. It reflects some increased willingness to consider authoritarian alternatives. That is greater in some societies than in others. But in none of these countries do we see anything close to a majority or a plurality of citizens saying, yeah, it might be better to have an authoritarian regime. We see skepticism, we see doubt. It's not unrelated to the disappointing performance of many democracies and the perceived lack of responsiveness. And this poses challenges that democracy needs to rise to, as it has in earlier eras. At the same time, I think we need to take a broader picture. Democracy is still the overwhelmingly preferred form of government internationally. And even in the poorest region of the world, which is sub-Saharan Africa, overwhelming majorities of the population in most countries say they want to live in a democracy and even manifest support for fairly liberal constitutional values, not just electoral democracy, but judicial independence, term limits, a rule of law.
So you think then this apparent rejection, which glad to see it mostly refuted, is not a rejection of democracy in itself, as you mentioned, perhaps of a specific aspect that democracies show nowadays, or some types of it that aren't really desirable. Is that correct?
I would say that there's been an erosion in total, unquestioning, and unconditional support for democracy. This is a warning sign that we should not take democracy for granted. It is a warning sign that we can't forever count on people committing to democracy just out of a lack of desire to live in an authoritarian regime. That we can't assume that the Churchill hypothesis that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time, is enough to motivate commitment to democracy in the long run. It can't just be the least bad alternative. It has to offer a positive alternative to people, a working alternative. And this is a challenge in two respects. It's a challenge to democratic politicians, civil society, and democratic thinkers and designers to consider how democracy can be reformed and invigorated so it can work better. And it's a challenge to civil society and the educational system, religious and moral and philosophical leaders to work to educate for democracy and to renew with every generation a deep popular attachment to democracy, which is why civic education is such an important task for each new generation, why we can't assume that democratic values will be transmitted to the next generation just by default. And if I may say so, I think it is a reason why the work of organizations like Instituto Atuação is so important.
I appreciate it. And you mentioned civic education as a form of getting young people back on track on democracy. So what are the ways you see that young people can regain, that democracy can regain credibility with young people?
Well, the most important way, and I would say it is an indispensable way, is to show, number one, that democracy can be, as it has been in the past, over the long run, responsive to the concerns and fears and anxieties of people, in this case about globalization, about declining economic growth, about social justice, about distribution of incomes, that social policy outcomes over time can be fiscally sustainable, socially fair and inclusive, and that they can recreate a decent and dynamic economy and society. That in the long run is indispensable. Democracy must also show that it can work in the short run to produce some kinds of policies, that the politicians, the Congress, are capable of coming to some agreement on policy responses and putting aside the intense partisanship that often blocks any kind of legislative agreement at all. Politicians must show a certain degree of civility toward one another and respect for the democratic rules of the game, and people must come to see that politics is not drenched in corruption and self-interest, that not all politicians are corrupt, and that the legal and judicial system, combined with the civil society and the mass media, are capable of working to contain corruption, to punish the corrupt, and to create a cleaner and more transparent pattern of politics and governance.
That's great, and since you mentioned this, a bit about political parties, that's one of the most frequent targets of frustration for people around the world. How do you see the future of political parties in light of recent events, and how can they adapt to this growing demand of better representativeness, better politics?
Well, we live in an era of profound democratic contradictions. None is more palpable than the contradiction regarding political parties. There really is no way to structure a decently functioning large-scale democracy without political parties. Parties structure competition, they recruit candidates, they formulate programs, they simplify the formidable challenge for voters of electoral choice, of choosing between candidates. They facilitate the mobilization of support in the legislature as well as in society. Parties perform a number of functions for democracy that remain quite necessary. At the same time, parties, like all institutions, organizations, can become self-interested, stale, corrupt, self-interested, and they need to be subject to competition, to new entrants into the market with more innovative ideas and proposals, and to a general openness and accountability in the political marketplace. Just think of what the automobile industry would be like, or the information industry would be like, if 30 years ago we'd said, that's it, we have all the companies we're going to have, no more can enter the marketplace. We would have stifled innovation. So I think it's important that if you don't want to see complete and total cynicism about parties, that the political marketplace allow for the entry of new political parties and more fluid and dynamic political formations. I also think that we need to structure or allow means for political parties to renew themselves and renew their political leaderships so that they can be appealing to the voters with fresh faces, new ideas, and an opportunity for circulation of elites and renovation over time. I'm not sure it's a good idea for a democracy to allow a president to come back once he or she has served particularly 2 terms. We have a limit in the United States now. It's not only 2 consecutive terms, it's 2 terms for life. And I think that's healthy over time in promoting renovation and circulation of elites and rejuvenation of the party system. I think a party system in a democracy may be healthier when it encourages the cultivation and promotion of new leaders and fresh ideas.
Now talking about Brazil a bit, as most of the world is aware of now, we have been under severe economic and political strain and facing a deep recession, high unemployment rates, unprecedented exposure of large corruption schemes, and recurrent mass demonstrations. We've just missed one in Curitiba, and widespread rejection of established political parties. So considering the state that our democracy is a relatively young one, and this complex scenario that we're in, how do you assess the prospect of stability, of democratic stability in our country?
Well, I should hasten to begin by saying that I'm not an expert on Brazilian politics. I think what can be said is that this kind of crisis is not unique to Brazil. Korea, South Korea, just impeached and removed its president from office. This is not the first time that Korea has had a crisis of presidentialism, with the presidential term having to be cut short and plummeting in popular support and confidence in an incumbent president. You know, it might be time again in Brazil. I don't think this would be the first time for people to ask the question about whether the presidential system is really the best system for cultivating democratic flexibility and sustainability. I realize moving to a parliamentary system would be a big shock and is very unlikely. But I think given Brazil's history over the last 30 or so years of restored democracy, there could be value in asking some basic questions about constitutional structure, about structure of the electoral system. How might the democratic institutions in Brazil be updated for these purposes? Another point I would make, we have a saying in the United States, in the English language, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. There's an old saying that crisis is a period of danger and stress, but it's also a period of opportunity. Crisis focuses the collective mind on the deficiencies of the system. A crisis may render a society more ready to undertake painful reforms because they realize the profundity of what's at stake and the dysfunctionality or unsustainability of existing social and economic policies and maybe political institutional arrangements. Some of your leading scholars and professors in Brazil have certainly made me aware of the fiscal unsustainability of the current system of pensions in Brazil. We have a similar problem in the United States. It's more incremental and longer term. But most societies, some developing societies, a lot of advanced industrial societies are either going to have to make changes in their system of social security, retirement, and pensions, including pensions and rules of retirement for government workers, or they're simply going to go bankrupt. And I think it's important for all societies periodically to step back and look at their policies of taxation and expenditure and ask basic questions about distributive fairness. In many societies, these rules and policies and practices may look on the surface to have a redistributive character, but what they're really doing is benefiting a middle class or a certain class of beneficiaries who are not the most in need and preventing the economy and society from responding to the needs of people who are most urgently in need, including of an expanding economy and of jobs. So I hope the crisis will be used by the current political leadership, by the mass media, by society in engaging in conversations with itself, and by the political leadership that will emerge out of the next national elections late next year. I hope the crisis will be used, first of all, to enact certain urgently necessary social and economic reforms to make fiscal policy more sustainable, social policy fair, and economic policy more conducive to economic growth and investment. I think that's the package by which Brazil is going to exit its current economic crisis and realize the potential that everybody knows it has as one of the leading emerging market economies. There's no reason why the Brazilian economy shouldn't be attracting large volumes of foreign investment. For many decades now, I think Brazilians are well aware, foreign investors and financial markets have looked at Brazil with considerable anticipation and enthusiasm about the long-term possibilities, the potential, if, only if, the economic policies were more conducive. The social and political alignments are right. Just think of what could happen in Brazil. The potential hasn't gone away. It was exploited for a period of time. It's still there, but the investment is not going to flow in unless there's more conducive economic policies, more sustainable fiscal policies, social policies that will create a new social bargain in society, and a refashioning of the political consensus in a way that restores public faith in government and in democracy. That's going to require, I think, some political institutional reforms. It's going to require, certainly, and I think unavoidably, getting to the bottom of the current corruption scandals that are working their way through the courts and the mass media, and a kind of cleansing and renewal of the system.
That's great. And just talking about Brazilian crisis, let's get back into some other crises abroad. And here's
We're not
some
short
thoughts.
of crises to talk about.
Yeah, we're not short at all. In response to events as Brexit and Trump's election, electoral shocks, right? Many relevant scholars and influential people around the world have been suggesting that some decisions perhaps are too important to be left for people to decide on. On the other hand, we are seeing a rise of judiciary activism as well, that is, decisions made by unelected magistrates that affect the lives of many people. Robert Dahl affirms in Democracy and Its Critics that the main opponent to democracy is the idea of guardianship, that experts should decide for the people in a form of vanguard party, as Lenin once proposed, actually. English thinker G.K. Chesterton once said that the democratic faith consists in letting people decide the most important matters. Is it not then a contradiction, this appeal to experts in democracies?
I think there is a tension and ultimately a certain contradiction in the entire conceptual architecture of liberal democracy. Because keep in mind, liberal democracy is a compromise or an integration of three big principles. The principle of majority rule or popular sovereignty, let the people decide. The principle of minority rights, constitutionalism, and the affirmation of civil liberties, that there are things in a liberal democracy that the people are not allowed to do, that a temporary majority cannot take away the rights of the minority or of vulnerable populations, even including the rights of non-citizens, of immigrants, and that there has to be a certain floor of human dignity and human rights that is protected from the temporary and potentially intemperate will of the majority. And the third dimension has to do with the rule of law, horizontal accountability, and, if you will, delegation of certain levels of decision-making to experts, either in the judicial system, so that you get judges deciding the administration of justice and not popular emotions, So you get central bankers trying to preserve macroeconomic and fiscal stability, and not politicians or temporary majorities who may just want to inflate the economy for temporary advantage. We've seen how that can pave a path to financial ruin for a country. And so that you have a competent state. Now, there's no way to maximize all of these values because they're in conflict. That's the contradiction. If you seek to have a state that is too insulated from popular accountability and technocratically competent and expert, then you risk going down the road that Dahl articulated, or perhaps foresaw, to the tyranny of a meritocratic elite in defiance of popular will and popular anxieties. I think there has been too much of that in the European Union, and the flow of power and authority, not only from the people, but from elected national governments to the technocratic superstructure of the European Union and its bureaucracy in Brussels. And a lot of the anti-European sentiment has been a reaction against this level of delegation of popular decision-making authority and responsibility to some extent, unelected technocrats. And it's very pervasive, and it involves all sorts of rules in economy and social life that many people in Europe, many Democrats in Europe, even many advocates of good government in Europe believe have gone too far. So certainly that needs to be looked at and borne in mind. At the same time, we certainly have a major reaction in the United States, and I think in other democracies, against what sometimes seem to be judicial activism, judges deciding social policy in defiance of popular will. But I would raise these caveats against those who criticize judicial activism by asking these questions. When a politician, maybe a popular politician, is being investigated for corruption or misuse of power, do we want his popular base of support to decide his or her guilt or innocence? Mm-hmm. Should this be a matter of trial, guilty or innocent, by the way, by public opinion polls? I think we either have a rule of law or we don't. And the rule of law and the administration of justice should not be subject to a democratic vote. They should be, I mean, you can have a democratic trial by jury in some systems. We have in the United States. But you can't have a popular vote deciding what the outcome of a judicial trial should be, particularly for a criminal offense. And this is why I believe strongly that no judge in any democracy should ever have to stand for election. I think this is a perversion of the rule of law, and it's a big flaw in the American system of democracy. This doesn't mean that federal judges who do not have to stand ever for election, they have lifetime appointments, or our constitutional court judges on the Supreme Court should be legislating reality. But it does mean that they should be insulated from temporary popular pressures. I think one of the lessons we're learning, I repeat, is that the understanding of classically and in contemporaneous form democracy and its strengths, its promise, its flaws, its need for reform, and of the basic values and ideas and different models of democracy, this must be renewed for each generation. and updated for each generation. And we need to invest much more in that than we have been.
That's great. I appreciate that. And just to sum things up, a final question before this whole scenario of uncertainties in the world, let's just briefly comment on the future of a democratic political culture, just to pick on what you just said. In a recent book of yours, Developing Democracy, you mentioned some cultural correlates to democracy, such as moderation, compromise, cooperation, belief in democratic regime. Do you believe that these are still the values that should guide us, and what other essential values and beliefs should we add to this list, perhaps?
Well, you start with the most obvious. Democracy requires citizens to believe that it is worth defending. So that is irreducible. It also requires an active and vigilant citizenry, not just, of course, in electoral politics, but in civil society. Apathy or resignation or blind submission to authority, I think we've learned bitterly over and over, are the enemies of both democracy and good governance, and inevitably lead to a deterioration in the quality of governance. So citizens need to participate actively in politics. They need to come out to vote. They need to inform themselves in a thoughtful way and in a critical way, not in a blindly accepting way, not only in terms of what politicians are saying, but in terms of what media practitioners are saying, and what social media commentators are saying, and what news feeds are saying on the internet, and what their friends are saying. And so this requires that we develop anew, for the internet age, a capacity to think critically, to reason carefully, to question independently what we're seeing and reading on the internet, and to formulate a synthetic approach to information that doesn't just live in the bubble of someone's social media world and reinforce the echo chamber of friendly, reinforcing common opinions, but extends outside that to listen to different points of view. It's not a natural thing to do. As human beings, we all have tribalistic impulses. We want to trust and interact with people we like, people we feel almost a family relationship with, people we feel comfortable with. We need to constantly be pressed to get outside our comfort zones, hear different points of view, search for different forms of information, and have a little bit of diversity in our realms of interaction. And we need to think about how social media can provide cues, and how citizens, when they are young, can develop habits of the heart and habits of information usage that do some of this. This is a very creative challenge for schools, for social media platforms, for moral and ethical leaders in society. That leads to the balancing nature of a democratic political culture. It's not only about vigilance, it's not only about participation, it's not only about the autonomous assertion of interests. It's also about listening, about reasoning, about mutual respect, about an understanding that democracy involves give and take, tolerance and compromise. And we are going to be in real difficulty, particularly in the internet age, where social media has developed such a rough, rude, polarizing, and venomous tone. We are going to be in real trouble if we don't cultivate and affirm for the rising generations that are entering this dangerous space the need for certain rules and ethics of mutual respect, civility, compromise, and a certain open-mindedness, willingness to listen to the other and consider alternative points of view. That is as much of the essence of liberal democracy and sustainable democracy as is the individual impulse to participate, give voice, and assert his or her interests and values.
That will be it. Thank you very much, Professor, for being here. Until next time, yeah?
Okay,
All right,
thank you.
Thank you.